The streets were dark, the night air crisp, and the only sounds that filled the empty roads were the soft hum of a taxi's engine and the distant rumble of motorcycles. John Carter, an experienced taxi driver, was at the wheel of his familiar yellow cab, making his usual rounds in the quiet outskirts of town. He had been driving for years, finding a strange peace in the rhythm of the road. His hands, calloused from years of hard work, gripped the steering wheel with ease as he navigated the winding roads, his mind lost in thought. What John didn't know was that his usual shift was about to be anything but ordinary. From the shadows behind him, the unmistakable roar of engines grew louder. 6 motorcycles appeared, revving their engines as they neared his cab. Their riders were clad in leather jackets, each one more intimidating than the last. These weren't just any bikers. They were known troublemakers, a gang that had terrorized local neighborhoods for years, always looking for someone to mess with. And tonight, they had their eyes set on John. The lead biker, a burly man with a thick beard and a menacing grin, looked over at John's cab as he sped up alongside him. John glanced in his rearview mirror, spotting the group of bikers. He didn't flinch. He had been through far worse in his life, but there was something about the way the bikers circled him that made his instincts kick in. The group was gaining on him, weaving in and out of traffic, their engines growling louder as they closed the gap. John knew they were looking for trouble, and he was about to find out just how much trouble they could cause. The biker gang pulled up alongside his taxi, revving their engines as they tried to intimidate him. The lead biker, who was clearly the alpha of the group, leaned in close to John's window and shouted, "Hey, you lost? Or just dumb enough to drive around these parts?" John's eyes remained forward, his face impassive. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. He wasn't worried about a few loudmouths on bikes. He had dealt with far worse before. But what he didn't know was that this encounter would be anything but ordinary. The bikers, sensing the lack of reaction from John, began to circle his taxi like sharks closing in on their prey. The leader of the group, Tyler Bones Jackson, looked over at his crew with a wicked grin, his eyes flashing with mischief. The other bikers, younger and eager to prove themselves, followed his lead without question. "Come on, old man. Don't be shy," Bones shouted from his motorcycle, his voice full of mockery. "What's the matter? Too scared to talk to us?" John didn't respond. He wasn't going to dignify their taunts with an answer. He kept his hands steady on the wheel, focusing on the road ahead, but he could feel the tension rising. The gang was testing him, pushing his buttons, and he knew exactly what they were trying to do. They were trying to provoke him into reacting, to give them a reason to escalate things further. But John wasn't about to let that happen. Not tonight. Not when he knew what he was capable of. The streetlights flickered as the bikers continued to ride in circles around him, their engines growling louder with each pass. Bones leaned in closer, practically on top of John's cab now. He was trying to get a reaction, to see if he could intimidate the older man into cowering. The other bikers laughed, enjoying the show. They had no idea who they were dealing with. John kept his cool, his eyes scanning the street ahead. He wasn't in the mood for games, but he knew that if he didn't stand his ground, things were only going to get worse. And that's when one of the bikers, Jimmy, the youngest member of the gang, made a fatal mistake. Jimmy, eager to prove himself to the older bikers, rode up alongside John's cab, his motorcycle engine roaring in an attempt to drown out the sound of John's taxi. He revved the engine a few times, edging closer until his bike was practically touching the side of the vehicle. "Hey, cabbie!" Jimmy yelled, his voice dripping with bravado. "You scared? You gonna let us run you off the road, or are you gonna say something?" John's fingers tightened on the steering wheel, but he said nothing. He wasn't going to give this kid the satisfaction. He was too old for this childish nonsense. But Jimmy wasn't backing down. He swerved his bike dangerously close to John's cab, just inches away from the side mirror. John could feel the pressure mounting as the young biker tried to push him into making a mistake. That's when Jimmy kicked out his leg and slammed it into the side of John's cab. The impact was jarring, and a loud bang echoed through the air. "Watch it, kid," John muttered under his breath. He had seen this type of behavior before. Young punks trying to act tough, thinking they could scare anyone. But John wasn't just anyone. His calm, collected demeanor hid a history that none of these bikers could even begin to understand. Bones, seeing the confrontation escalate, let out a loud laugh. "You think you're tough, old man?" he shouted, as the other bikers circled in closer. "Why don't you step out here and show us what you got? You're nothing but a washed-up cabbie." The gang's laughter grew louder, and the tension in the air was palpable. John knew they were about to make their move. He could feel it in his bones. But this time, it wasn't just a bunch of drunk, reckless kids looking to have a laugh. These bikers were serious. And John wasn't going to wait around to find out just how serious. He had been through enough in his life to know that when you're confronted with danger, you don't back down. You don't wait for the fight to come to you. You make the first move, and you end it before it starts. John glanced in the side mirror and saw that the bikers were closing in on him. There were 6 of them, and they weren't showing any signs of stopping. His options were limited. He could try to outrun them, but that would only make things worse. He could pull over and try to defuse the situation, but that wasn't likely to work with a group of men like this. So, John did the only thing he knew would end this quickly. He slammed on the brakes. The sudden action caught the bikers off guard. Their bikes jolted forward, their momentum thrown off as they tried to react. Jimmy, the young hothead, was the first to lose control. His motorcycle skidded, his wheels locking up as he tried to correct himself. But it was too late. He crashed into the side of John's cab, the impact sending him sprawling to the pavement. "Jimmy!" Bones shouted, his voice filled with anger. "What the hell are you doing?" The others didn't hesitate. They circled John's cab, revving their engines in an attempt to intimidate him further. Bones dismounted his bike and approached the cab with a dangerous glint in his eyes. He was used to being in control, used to being the one calling the shots, and right now, he was determined to make John pay for daring to defy him. "You think you can mess with us, old man?" Bones growled, his voice low and menacing. He pulled a knife from his jacket, the steel blade glinting under the streetlights. "Let me show you how we deal with people who get in our way." John remained silent, but his heart was beating steadily, his senses sharp. He had been in dangerous situations before, much worse than this, and he knew what had to be done. He wasn't scared. He wasn't going to let these punks get the best of him. Without warning, John flung open the door, slamming it into one of the bikers, sending him crashing to the ground. Before anyone could react, John was out of the cab, his body moving with the precision and speed of a man who had been trained to fight. Bones, caught off guard by the sudden attack, lunged forward with the knife, but John was faster. In one fluid motion, John grabbed Bones by the wrist, twisting it with a strength that surprised even him. The knife flew out of Bones's hand, skittering across the pavement as John shoved him to the ground with a force that knocked the air out of him. The other bikers hesitated, not sure whether to jump in or retreat. But John wasn't waiting for their decision. He was already moving, his instincts kicking in as he faced off against the next biker who tried to get in his way. The streetlights above flickered as the tension between John and the bikers reached a boiling point. Bones, gasping for air on the pavement, tried to regain his composure. His pride was wounded, but more importantly, his grip on the situation had slipped. The bikers, usually the ones in control, now found themselves on the back foot, their leader sprawled out in the dirt. John wasn't waiting for them to make a move. He had been in situations like this before. Dangerous, chaotic, and unpredictable. But the difference now was that he wasn't just an ordinary man. His training, honed through years of discipline and combat as a Navy SEAL, had conditioned him to react in these kinds of moments. His instincts took over, moving faster than thought, as he faced down the group of bikers. The next biker to rush at him was Derek, a tall man with tattoos covering every inch of his arms. He swung a heavy chain in the air, aiming it at John's head. It was a brutal, crude weapon, But it didn't faze John. As Derek swung the chain, John ducked low and grabbed the link mid-swing, using the momentum to yank it out of Derek's hands. Before Derek could react, John delivered a swift punch to his gut, sending him stumbling back. "Get off him, Derek!" another biker shouted. And before John could take another step, the gang rallied together, their frustration turning into a wild surge of aggression. It was clear they didn't know who they were dealing with. The bikers tried to swarm him, but John wasn't overwhelmed. His movements were calculated, efficient. He sidestepped the next attacker, Mark, who had drawn a baseball bat. Mark swung the bat at John's ribs, but John, anticipating the blow, grabbed the bat with one hand and twisted it out of Mark's grip. A well-timed knee to Mark's stomach knocked the wind out of him, and he collapsed onto the ground. John wasn't just defending himself. He was taking control of the situation, neutralizing the bikers one by one. His mind was clear, his senses sharp. But even with his advantage, he wasn't underestimating the danger. These men might be reckless, but they were still dangerous, desperate. He had to end it quickly. Bones, now staggering to his feet, was seething with anger. His gang was being picked off one by one, and his pride was taking a serious blow. He pulled a knife from his jacket again, his fingers shaking with rage. "You've made a big mistake, old man," Bones growled. "We were just having some fun, but you don't walk away from us without paying the price." The sound of a blade slicing through the air filled the night as Bones lunged toward John. The knife was quick, but John was quicker. He sidestepped, feeling the rush of air as the blade missed its mark by inches. With a single move, John grabbed Bones by the wrist, twisting his arm behind his back with a force that made Bones yelp in pain. The knife fell to the ground with a clatter, and Bones was on his knees before John, breathing heavily. John leaned down, his voice calm and steady. "I don't want any more trouble. Leave now, and no one else gets hurt." But Bones wasn't ready to give up. "You think you've won? You're a dead man walking." He spat, glaring up at John, his face contorted with fury. But his words didn't hold the same weight anymore. The fight had drained from him, and his gang, once a unified front, was now scattered and hesitant, realizing they were in over their heads. The rest of the bikers, watching their leader defeated, began to retreat, one by one. They realized that they weren't facing just some random taxi driver. This man, this unassuming figure in the yellow cab, had dismantled them with terrifying ease. They weren't up against a simple civilian. They had tangled with a warrior, a man who had been trained to survive, to fight, to win. As the last of the bikers revved their engines and sped off into the night, John stood in the middle of the street, catching his breath. His body was tense, his heart racing, but he wasn't afraid. He wasn't even angry. He was just relieved. Relieved that he had handled it. Relieved that the situation was over. But before he could turn to get back into his cab, a voice called out from behind him. "Wait!" John turned around, his eyes narrowing as he spotted Derek, the one biker who had been closest to him throughout the fight. Derek was still standing, albeit with difficulty, holding his side as he limped toward John. The anger and pride that had once consumed him were now replaced by something else. Fear, confusion, maybe even a bit of respect. "You're not just some cab driver, are you?" Derek said, his voice quieter now, more cautious. "Who the hell are you?" John stood still for a moment, considering the question. He didn't owe these bikers any explanation, but something about Derek's tone made him pause. He knew that the bikers wouldn't walk away thinking he was just some average guy. John finally answered, his voice low. "I'm just a man trying to make a living, but I've had a few jobs before this one." Derek's eyes widened slightly as he pieced the words together. The air seemed to thicken between them. He had heard the rumors about men like John, about ex-soldiers who could kill without thinking, who had skills honed in battle. But hearing it from John's mouth made it real. "You're ex-military," Derek said, almost to himself. His voice was filled with disbelief. John didn't confirm or deny it. Instead, he simply nodded and took a step back, heading toward his cab. "I was Navy, but it doesn't matter now. You should go before you get yourself into more trouble." Derek stood there, his mind racing, trying to digest what had just happened. The bikers who had terrorized neighborhoods for years had just encountered a force far beyond their expectations. It was a humbling moment for him, and for the others who had been part of this failed assault. As John climbed back into his cab, Derek slowly backed away, realizing that some battles weren't meant to be won. The gang had underestimated the wrong man, and now all they could do was disappear into the night, nursing their wounds and licking their pride. If you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from. I want to hear your thoughts. What do you think will happen next? Are these bikers really going to just walk away? Or is something else coming? Stay tuned for more. The noise of the revving motorcycles had faded into the distance, leaving only the quiet hum of the streetlights above and the occasional distant car passing by. The area, once full of tension and chaos, was now eerily calm. John sat in his cab for a moment, hands gripping the wheel, breathing deeply as he collected his thoughts. It wasn't often that his past came rushing back to him like this, but the feeling of danger had a way of bringing it all to the surface. The fight with the bikers had been quick, violent, but efficient. John knew the outcome would be the same. He'd been in situations like this before. What bothered him more, however, was the realization that it wasn't just some random encounter. The bikers were no ordinary street thugs. They were part of something larger, a network of criminals who often operated in the shadows. The fact that they targeted him was more than just a case of bad luck. It was a signal, something that gnawed at the back of his mind. John wasn't naive. He understood that trouble didn't always end just because you walked away from it. In fact, it often only escalated. These bikers, while they had been humbled tonight, were part of a larger organization, a motorcycle gang that ran illicit activities across the city. They wouldn't forget the humiliation, and they sure as hell wouldn't let it slide. John's thoughts were interrupted as the faint sound of footsteps echoed through the alley next to the street. He snapped to attention, his instincts firing as he scanned the area. The footsteps grew louder, growing closer and closer to the cab. He wasn't surprised when a shadow fell over the driver's side window. A quick glance confirmed what he already suspected. Derek, the one biker who had been closest to him, was walking toward him. His face was bruised, his body battered, but he wasn't alone this time. He had a few other men trailing behind him, eyes darting around as if they were trying to figure out if this was a trap. John didn't move. He simply waited, hands resting on the wheel, his eyes trained on the rearview mirror. He knew what was coming. He knew they wouldn't give up so easily. But this time, he was ready. He'd dealt with threats before, and he'd handle this the same way. The only difference now was the weight of their presence. There was something more menacing about their quiet approach. Derek stopped a few feet from the cab, his eyes narrowing as he studied John. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. John could feel it, the weight of it pressing in from all sides. It was clear that Derek hadn't given up on his pride. He was looking for answers, for something to salvage. "You still here?" Derek's voice was rough, like gravel being ground underfoot. There was no sign of the swagger that had marked him earlier. Now, he seemed more cautious, almost like he was trying to assess the situation before making his next move. John didn't respond immediately. He let the silence hang in the air, letting Derek stew in it. He wasn't in any rush to engage, not until he knew exactly what the man wanted. But it was becoming clear that Derek wasn't here to just apologize and walk away. "I don't know what you are, man," Derek continued, his voice quieter now. "But I can tell you're no normal guy. No way you'd take us down like that if you weren't trained for it. Who the hell are you?" John's gaze never left the rearview mirror as he spoke, his voice steady and calm. I told you before. Just a man trying to make a living." Derek seemed to think about that for a moment, his eyes flicking over to the other bikers standing behind him. It wasn't a large group, just 3 men, but their presence was enough to make the air feel even more suffocating. They were all sizing John up, wondering if he was truly just a man trying to make a living, or if there was something more they were missing. "You don't get it, do you?" Derek said, stepping forward. "We don't walk away from stuff like this. You don't embarrass us and expect us to forget it. We're gonna come back. We always come back." John's lips curled slightly at the edges, the faintest trace of a smile forming as he turned his head slightly to look Derek in the eye. "I'm sure you will. But let me give you a piece of advice, Derek. You want to walk away from this. You don't want to keep pushing. Trust me on that." Derek's brow furrowed, and for a moment, it seemed like he was considering John's words. Then, his expression hardened, and he took another step closer. "You think we're scared of you? You're just one guy. We're a gang. You can't take all of us down." At this, John finally pushed the door open, stepping out of the cab with calculated slowness. The bikers flinched, but John didn't rush. He wanted them to feel that they had no control here, that no matter how many of them there were, they weren't in charge anymore. "You misunderstand me," John said quietly, his voice laced with calm authority. "I don't need to take all of you down. I just need to take down enough of you that the rest of you start thinking twice before making any more moves." Derek took a step back, his bravado slipping away as the reality of the situation began to sink in. His eyes darted nervously from John to his men, as if he was weighing his options. And in that moment, John could see the shift. The moment when a man realizes that he's out of his depth. It wasn't fear that John saw in Derek's eyes, but a creeping realization that things had gone too far. The bikers began to shuffle uncomfortably, exchanging uncertain glances. They had come to intimidate, to reclaim their sense of dominance. But instead, they were the ones who had been outclassed, outmatched. John's reputation in their world would spread quickly now. Word would get around that a gang had gone after an ex-Navy SEAL, and that would be enough to make anyone think twice. For a long moment, the tension lingered in the air. Then, Derek muttered a curse under his breath, turned on his heel, and signaled to his men. They retreated without another word, their heavy footsteps echoing down the street. As they disappeared into the night, John leaned against his cab, letting out a deep breath. He had won. Again. But the victory felt hollow. He knew this wasn't the end of it. It was just the beginning. The bikers would go off, lick their wounds, regroup, and sooner or later, they'd come back. It was only a matter of time. John climbed back into his cab and slammed the door shut, his mind already racing ahead to what came next. He had dealt with the immediate threat, but the real challenge was still out there, waiting. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm orange hue over the city as John navigated his cab down familiar streets. Despite the adrenaline still coursing through his veins, a sense of calm settled over him as he steered the vehicle through the traffic. He had dealt with threats before, both on the battlefield and in the streets. But there was always that lingering tension, the feeling that you were never truly safe. Even now, as the city bustled around him, John couldn't shake the thought that something was about to go down. His instincts were never wrong. John's mind drifted back to the bikers. Their faces were burned into his memory, each one a reminder of the decision he had made years ago. When he'd left the Navy, he hadn't been sure what kind of life he wanted. He'd tried the quiet life for a while, thinking he could live in peace. But peace didn't come easily when you'd seen what he had. The world was full of people who only understood power through violence. And unfortunately, he was the type of man who could make that violence effective. But, as much as he wanted to focus on the bikers, he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in the back of his mind. He knew they wouldn't take his threat lightly. Not because they were scared of him, but because they had no idea who they were dealing with. Biker gangs, as dangerous as they were, had a way of seeing everything through their own lens. They liked to think they were untouchable, that they could operate without consequences. John had given them a reality check. But the truth was, he wasn't naive enough to believe that would be enough. They were the kind of group that would hold a grudge, and they'd come back for payback, no matter how long it took. John's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. He reached down and fumbled for it, his hand brushing against the cold surface of the screen before he unlocked it. The name that popped up on the screen made him stiffen. Detective Harris. He didn't have a good history with the local police, especially when it came to situations like this. But he knew the detective well enough to know that the call wasn't entirely bad news. Harris had always respected John's abilities. He had to, given what John had done for the force in the past. He answered the call, lifting the phone to his ear. "John." Harris's voice came through, low and steady. "I know you've been laying low, but we need to talk. There's something bigger happening with those bikers than you think. They're not just your typical gang." John's grip tightened on the wheel, his eyes scanning the street ahead of him. "What do you mean?" "I've dealt with them. They're a nuisance, but nothing more." "Yeah, that's what I thought too," Harris replied, his tone heavy with concern. "But I've been digging around, and I think you need to know something. This isn't just about street violence anymore. They're part of something bigger, an operation that's been flying under the radar for a while. Drugs, weapons, extortion, you name it." John's heart rate kicked up. He had suspected something like this, but hearing it confirmed by someone inside the system made it all the more real. The bikers weren't just a nuisance. They were a symptom of a larger problem. "You're telling me they're connected to organized crime?" John asked, keeping his voice neutral. He needed to stay focused. The last thing he needed was to let his emotions get the best of him. "I don't have all the details yet," Harris replied, "but I'm working on it. I'm trying to get some intel on their operation. If you can help me out, we might be able to stop something big before it goes too far. I know you've got a way with these people. Your background helps." John didn't need any more explanation. He understood exactly what Harris was asking. The truth was, John was always willing to help the law when it came to bigger threats. But there was a part of him that also enjoyed working alone. There was less risk of getting compromised that way. Still, this wasn't a time for pride. The stakes had just been raised. "I'm listening," John said, his voice calm but edged with urgency. "There's a shipment coming in tomorrow," Harris continued. "I don't have specifics yet, but it's going to be big. Whatever it is, it's something they don't want anyone to know about, and it's tied directly to the bikers. I need you to keep an eye out." "Where?" John asked, already planning his next move in his mind. "The docks. It's where they've been moving things lately. You'll need to be careful. There's more than just bikers involved, and we don't know who else is working with them." John's mind was already racing through possibilities. The docks were a familiar place for him, a world he knew well. It wasn't far from where he was now, and if things went down, he could be in position to intercept. But the problem was, the docks were a maze of warehouses and storage facilities, a perfect place to hide illicit activity. It would take more than just brute force to get the information they needed. He'd need to think like a tactician, use every advantage at his disposal. "I'll check it out," John said, already making plans in his mind. "But I need to know everything you have on the bikers. The more I know, the better I can deal with them." "I'll send you everything I've got," Harris replied. "Be careful, John. If they're as dangerous as I think they are, you're going to need more than just your usual tactics." "I'll be ready," John replied, hanging up the phone. He exhaled deeply, feeling the weight of what he had to do settle in. It was always the quiet moments before the storm that were the hardest, the calm before the chaos. But John wasn't one to shy away from danger. In fact, he thrived on it. The bikers had made a mistake, and now they were going to find out just how deep that mistake ran. He drove toward the docks, the streets becoming less populated as he neared the industrial area. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the night air was cool against his skin. It was a familiar feeling, the anticipation of what was to come. As much as he wanted to believe he could just drive in and resolve everything, he knew better. The bikers weren't amateurs. They had a network, and they had resources, and that made them dangerous. John's mind was sharp now, focused on what lay ahead. He wasn't just dealing with bikers anymore. He was dealing with something much bigger. But he wasn't afraid. He was prepared. He always was. The storm was coming. And this time, John would be ready. John reached the docks just after sunset. The streets now eerily quiet as the sound of the city faded behind him. The hum of the city's life was replaced by the lapping of water against the stone piers, the occasional creak of a rusty ship's hull, and the distant calls of seagulls. The docks were a sprawling maze of warehouses and storage containers, lit only by flickering street lamps and the dim glow of neon signs from nearby businesses that had seen better days. The air was thick with the smell of salt water and diesel, a stark contrast to the more polished parts of town. The docks had always been a place for the underworld to thrive. Deals made in the shadows, goods moved with minimal scrutiny. For years, John had been involved in operations here, but that was when he wore a different uniform and had a different purpose. Now, he was just a taxi driver who happened to have a particular set of skills that had kept him alive through more than one dangerous encounter. Skills that would serve him well tonight. His headlights cut through the darkness as he parked his cab just outside an old warehouse on the far end of the docks. From his vantage point, he could see the silhouettes of men unloading crates from the back of a truck and stacking them near the building's entrance. They weren't wearing uniforms, but their coordinated movements made it clear they were part of something larger. The heavy-set man leading the group had tattoos crawling up his neck, distinctive, marking him as one of the bikers John had seen earlier. But there were others too, some wearing plain clothes, but all of them looked like they were prepared for something shady. The mix of bikers and unknown faces was exactly what Harris had warned him about. John parked his cab and killed the engine, staying still for a moment. His eyes scanned the area, looking for anything that could give him more insight into what was happening. He didn't need to rush. Every move had to be calculated. He reached under his seat and pulled out a small duffel bag, the kind you'd use for a quick getaway, and unzipped it to check its contents. Inside were a few tools of the trade. Nothing flashy, but everything he needed. A tactical knife, a silenced pistol, and a few magazines of ammunition. John wasn't about to walk into a situation like this unprepared. He slid the bag over his shoulder and exited the cab, his boots crunching on the gravel as he moved toward a narrow alley that ran along the side of the warehouse. His heart rate was steady, but his senses were heightened. He didn't like the unknowns in this situation, but that was part of the game. He'd have to rely on his instincts. The alley was dark, illuminated only by the occasional flicker of light from the street lamps. He kept his back against the wall as he moved cautiously, his eyes darting around for any signs of movement. There was a faint clatter of metal against concrete, but it was distant, coming from the opposite side of the warehouse. He didn't like it, but he kept moving. As he neared a corner of the warehouse, he stopped and crouched low. His military training kicked in, and he instinctively checked his surroundings before making his next move. From this vantage point, he could see the back of the truck more clearly. The men were unloading crates labeled with codes, their faces hidden in shadow. There was no telling what was inside them, but John had seen enough to know that nothing here was legitimate. The cargo wasn't the focus. It was the operation behind it that concerned him. These weren't simple street thugs. They were organized, and from what Harris had said, they were tied to something much larger. John felt his pulse quicken as his eyes locked onto one of the men unloading the crates. He recognized the jacket, a faded leather vest with a patch on the back. It wasn't just any biker gang. It was the Black Vultures, one of the most dangerous motorcycle clubs in the region. They were known for running arms, drugs, and human trafficking operations. Their presence here was no accident. They were moving something, and John was damn sure it wasn't a shipment of TVs. His mind raced as he considered his next steps. There were too many of them for a direct confrontation. Not to mention, He had no idea how many more were inside the warehouse. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. Stealth was his best option, and he needed to gather more intel before he could make his move. If he was going to stop them, he had to know what they were planning. John crouched lower and moved toward the back of the building, sticking to the shadows. He found a narrow window near the ground and peered inside. What he saw sent a chill down his spine. The warehouse was filled with crates, but it wasn't the crates that caught his attention. It was the men. A group of about a dozen bikers sat in the middle of the room, gathered around a table where a map was spread out in front of them. Several of them were pointing at different areas on the map, discussing locations. A few of them were taking notes, while others appeared to be texting on their phones. From the way they were speaking in hushed tones and glancing around, it was clear this wasn't just a routine drop. John's eyes narrowed as he recognized a few of the locations they were discussing. Major cities on the East Coast, strategic ports, and areas known for their high-value shipments. These were not casual movements. This was organized, and whatever they were planning, it was much bigger than anything John had expected. But what caught his attention the most was the man standing at the head of the table. He wasn't wearing the typical biker gear. Instead, he had a tailored suit on, his dark hair slicked back. He had the look of someone who didn't belong in the rough-and-tumble world of biker gangs. He was clean-shaven, his posture commanding as he leaned over the map, pointing to different locations with authority. This wasn't just another gang leader. This was someone with power, someone with connections. John's instincts flared. Whoever this man was, he was the key. And if he was behind all this, John knew this wasn't just about some biker gang running drugs. This was about something much larger. This man had connections, resources. He was the linchpin holding the operation together. Taking him down could bring the whole network to its knees. But John couldn't act yet. He needed more information. He had to figure out exactly who this man was and what his role in the operation was before making a move. As John pulled away from the window, he looked over at the cab, parked just far enough from the warehouse to remain unnoticed. But his mind was no longer on the bikers unloading crates. His mind was on the man in the suit, the man who was about to make a serious mistake. The storm was coming, and John was ready to weather it. The night was silent, save for the distant sound of waves crashing against the pier and the occasional gust of wind rustling the leaves of a nearby tree. John sat crouched behind the corner of the warehouse, his mind calculating every detail. His breath was steady, but his thoughts were a blur, each scenario more dangerous than the last. There was something about the man in the suit that gnawed at him. This wasn't just a drug deal or a weapons exchange. This was high stakes, and John wasn't going to let the opportunity slip away. He wasn't about to take any chances. He wasn't the man he used to be, someone who could rush headlong into a mission without thinking of the consequences. He knew better now. His experience, his years of training, had taught him to plan, observe, and wait for the right moment. He glanced once more at the back of the warehouse, the group of bikers still gathered around the table, their voices low but intense. The man in the suit was pointing at locations on the map, his finger tracing specific areas as he spoke, and the bikers nodded in agreement. John's sharp eyes scanned the group's every movement, mentally noting the positions of everyone in the room. He needed to understand their habits, their vulnerabilities. He couldn't afford to make a single mistake. After a moment, John pulled back from the window and retreated into the shadows. He knew he had limited time. He couldn't just wait for hours. Eventually, someone would notice the cab parked outside. Or worse, someone would stumble across him as he moved through the darkness. His first instinct was to leave the area, but the feeling that something big was about to happen kept him rooted to the spot. He wasn't about to walk away without understanding the full picture. John glanced at his phone, checking the time. It had been an hour since he first arrived. He'd spent that hour learning everything he could from his vantage point. The structure of the building, the number of men inside, the layout of the dockyard, and, most importantly, the man in the suit. The way he commanded the attention of the room, how everyone deferred to him. It was clear he was the one pulling the strings. But there was something else that John had picked up on. Something small, but crucial. The man in the suit hadn't once looked at the door or windows. He hadn't been concerned about security, not in the way a typical gang leader would. There were no guards, no lookout. It was as if he knew no one would dare approach. That alone spoke volumes. This wasn't just a gang operation. This was something far more organized, possibly far more dangerous. John reached for his jacket and pulled it tighter around his body, the cool night air starting to nip at his skin. He could feel the weight of his decision pressing on him. He couldn't afford to be reckless. This man in the suit wasn't just some low-level drug dealer. John was almost certain of it now. This was an international operation, and if he was going to bring it down, he needed to be precise. Every move had to be calculated. One misstep, and he might find himself facing the wrath of more than just a biker gang. He could be dealing with enemies far more dangerous than anything he had faced in his military career. But for now, all he had was his instincts and the knowledge that he needed more time. John moved back to the side of the building, his mind running through the various ways he could gather more information. He needed to get inside, get closer to the action. His eyes flicked to the small window once more, scanning for any signs of movement. The group of bikers was still around the table, but they seemed distracted now, shifting their weight in their seats, some checking their phones, others cracking their knuckles. The man in the suit was standing, looking at something on his phone, his back turned to the group. This was the moment John had been waiting for. With a quiet exhale, he moved swiftly, his footsteps soft against the gravel as he approached the building. His heart pounded in his chest, but he pushed the adrenaline aside. Focus. Patience. He'd been trained to think like this, to move like this. The world around him could burn, but he would be calm in the eye of the storm. He found a drain pipe running along the side of the warehouse. It wasn't the most elegant approach, but it would work. The window was low enough that he could reach it without much effort. His hands were steady as he reached up, gripping the cold metal of the pipe. He pulled himself up quickly, his feet scraping against the wall for traction as he ascended. Within moments, he was standing on a ledge just beneath the window. He peeked inside, holding his breath for a second to steady himself. The scene inside was exactly as he'd left it. The men still gathered around the table. The man in the suit still standing, now speaking to one of the bikers who had just entered the room. John's eyes flicked between the bikers, trying to read their body language, looking for anything that might give him an edge. He could see the tension in the room growing, as if they were preparing to move forward with whatever operation they were planning. He needed to get closer. Taking a deep breath, John carefully slid his knife out of its sheath. It wasn't for combat. At least, not yet. It was for precision. He cut a small opening in the window, just enough to slip through. The metal screeched softly as he moved, but he was in control. He slid through the gap, careful not to make a sound. His body tensed as he entered the dimly lit room, his eyes darting for a place to hide. The bikers were now all standing. The man in the suit was speaking in a low voice, and it was clear that something big was about to happen. John knew he had to make a decision. He couldn't just observe anymore. He was inside, and the time for action had come. His instincts kicked in. He dropped to a crouch behind a large stack of crates, his heart racing as he watched the men move. The man in the suit was now issuing orders, and John could hear snatches of conversation. "We move tonight. Get the shipment ready. And the target is in position." It was becoming clearer by the second. This wasn't just a simple cargo drop. It was an operation. A high-stakes mission that could mean trouble for everyone involved. John's breath came shallow now, his focus razor-sharp. He was no longer just a bystander. He was in the thick of it, and it was only a matter of time before everything would come crashing down. John's mind raced as the room around him filled with tension. His hands were steady, his body honed from years of training, But the complexity of what he was witnessing began to unravel something deeper, something far more dangerous than he had initially anticipated. The biker's words were slipping through his focus, and the man in the suits, every move seemed more calculated, deliberate. As he crouched behind the crates, watching intently, John allowed himself a few moments to piece the puzzle together. The room was dimly lit, but he could make out enough to see the tension in the bikers' movements, the subtle shifts in their postures, the way their hands hovered over the weapons at their sides. These weren't just typical street-level thugs. These were professionals. It wasn't just their gear, customized jackets, bulletproof vests, and tactical knives. It was their demeanor. They knew what they were doing. The man in the suit continued issuing orders, his voice calm but firm. John caught a few more snippets, but it wasn't until he heard the words, "The drop scheduled for midnight," that everything clicked. This was bigger than a street-level drug deal or a weapons shipment. This was an organized operation, involving high-value goods or perhaps something even more nefarious. But what exactly? John's training had prepared him for operations on a global scale, and this felt like one of those rare, high-profile missions where the stakes were enormous. His instincts told him that whoever these men were working for, they had resources, big resources. The last thing John needed was to be caught in the middle of something so massive. But it was too late for that. He was already too deep. He had to see this through. As the group continued to discuss logistics, John felt the cold sting of realization. The drop wasn't just about delivering goods. It was about moving a high-value target, someone who was key to this operation. He had been so focused on the bikers and the man in the suit that he hadn't considered the possibility that the shipment was something, or someone, far more valuable than material goods. His pulse quickened. He needed to act fast. For the first time since entering the warehouse, John began to formulate a plan. The next few minutes would determine everything. If he was going to stop this operation, and perhaps save a life, he had to make his move before it was too late. He was surrounded by enemies, but he wasn't outnumbered. His experience gave him the edge, even if the odds seemed stacked against him. The warehouse was large, but it wasn't a maze. He could work with that. He needed to create a distraction, something that would give him a chance to get closer to the man in the suit. The bikers had divided their attention. Most of them focused on the back corner of the room, while a few stood guard near the entrances. A perfect opportunity. John's eyes scanned the room for any items he could use to his advantage. His gaze fell on a small pile of metal barrels near the far wall. It wasn't much, but if he could knock them over, it would create a loud, chaotic sound, a perfect cover for him to move in closer. He carefully crawled toward the barrels, taking care to stay low and remain unseen. As he reached the barrels, he gave one a gentle push. It teetered on its base, ready to tip. He waited for the perfect moment, timing the sound of his movement with the right moment of distraction in the conversation. The bikers were still engrossed in their talk, and the man in the suit appeared to be checking his phone again. This was his chance. With a quick, sharp shove, John sent the barrel rolling, creating a loud crash that echoed through the building. The noise reverberated off the walls, and in that split second, the bikers' heads whipped around. The distraction was perfect. John wasted no time. He slipped from his crouch and darted across the room, using the confusion to mask his movement. His eyes locked on the man in the suit. He could see the surprise in the man's face, but there was no panic, no fear. The man's reaction was almost too calm. As John neared him, he realized that the man was waiting for this exact moment. His heart skipped a beat as he saw the slight smirk tug at the corner of the man's mouth. Everything clicked into place. The suit wasn't just overseeing the operation. He was orchestrating it. This wasn't some random drop or illicit exchange. This man had expected someone like John to show up. He was either tracking John's movements or had simply planned for an eventual breach. John's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just a biker gang operation anymore. This was a calculated, high-stakes operation with global implications. The man in the suit was well aware of his presence, The only question left was why. Before John could react, the man in the suit spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "I've been waiting for you, John." It was like a punch to the gut. John's pulse surged as the realization sank in. How did this man know him? How was he so prepared? John's military career was supposed to be long behind him, his name buried in the past. But somehow, this man knew exactly who he was. John's training kicked in. He had no time to process the shock. He needed to think, move, act. His hand instinctively reached for the pistol at his side. But before he could draw it, the man in the suit held up his hand, signaling for his men to stand down. The bikers were still on edge, but they hesitated. "Put it down, John," the man said, his voice cold. "You won't need it where you're going." John's mind raced. He didn't know what this man was planning, but one thing was clear. This wasn't a simple encounter. The man wasn't intimidated. He wasn't surprised. This was a game where John's survival depended on his next move, and that move had to be perfect. John's fingers brushed the handle of his gun, his thumb on the safety, but he didn't pull it. Not yet. He needed information. He needed leverage. As he met the man's eyes, he saw nothing but confidence, a calm, knowing look, as if he'd already won. It was time to change the game. John's mind raced as he weighed his options. The situation had shifted from one of survival to one of strategy. He could feel the man in the suit's eyes on him, calculating, assessing, as though he were simply one piece in a larger, more complex puzzle. Every moment that passed felt like a potential misstep, yet his training had always prepared him for these kinds of high-pressure situations. The bikers stood tense but uncertain, looking back and forth between John and their leader. The man in the suit had stepped back, maintaining a calm, deliberate composure, as though the unfolding events were all part of his plan. John's thoughts darted like lightning as he considered his next move. The key was to stay unpredictable. He couldn't let his enemies think they knew what he was going to do. "You think I don't know who you are, John?" The man in the suit's voice cut through the tense silence, sharp and precise. "I know all about you. I know about your little vacation. I know about your history. And I know why you're here." John's heart rate spiked, but his face remained stoic. The man's words were a puzzle, but he didn't have time to piece them together just yet. The most important thing now was to stay calm and stay one step ahead. He couldn't let this man provoke him into making a rash decision. "I didn't come here to talk," John said coolly, keeping his hand close to his weapon, though not yet drawing it. "I came here to finish something." The man in the suit chuckled, the sound hollow and condescending. "Finish something? You don't even know what you're in the middle of, John. This isn't some small-time operation you can take down with a gun. This is bigger than you, bigger than me, bigger than anything you've ever dealt with." John's eyes narrowed. He could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. The man wasn't just talking about drugs or weapons. It was something deeper, something darker. The type of people involved in this operation weren't the kind that could be taken down by force alone. They had connections, resources, and a network that spanned the globe. The challenge wasn't just defeating the bikers in the room. It was taking down a well-oiled machine that had been operating for years. "You're wrong," John said, his voice steady, despite the weight of the revelation. "You think I don't understand what's at stake here? I've seen this before. And I've taken down bigger threats than this." For a moment, there was silence. The man in the suit seemed to consider John's words, his eyes calculating. John kept his body relaxed, but his senses were on high alert. He was prepared for anything at this point, but he had to be smart. A head-on assault wasn't the answer. The bikers were heavily armed, and the man in the suit had a calm authority about him that made John feel like he was dealing with a much larger operation than he'd originally thought. Finally, the man in the suit spoke again, this time with a strange calmness. You've been a thorn in our side for too long, John. It's time you understood the truth. There's a reason why you were chosen to be part of this. John's brow furrowed as the man's words sank in. He'd been chosen. The thought unsettled him. There was no reason why someone like him, someone who had long since left the military, should be involved in this web of shadows, unless his past was exactly what the man in the suit needed. The man continued, his voice smooth and controlled. You were part of something much bigger than you ever realized. You don't remember, but you were used. You and your team, your whole squad, were involved in something that was never meant to be uncovered. John's pulse quickened. The words, never meant to be uncovered, resonated with him, striking a chord deep within his mind. He could feel the edges of a forgotten memory stirring. The pieces were there, but they were buried beneath the years, beneath the weight of countless operations and missions that had blurred together into one long blur of combat. You're lying, John spat, more to himself than to the man in the suit. I left it all behind. That's in the past. The man's eyes glinted with a knowing look. Oh, John, you haven't left it behind. They've kept you in the dark, but you were involved. This war, this operation, it never ended. And now it's time for you to finish it. John felt a cold wave of realization sweep over him. This was bigger than a few rogue bikers or a criminal gang. This was about something global, something that involved him. Whether he knew it or not, he could feel the web tightening around him. He wasn't just a bystander anymore. He was a player, caught in the middle of a much larger game. And the stakes had just been raised. The bikers were shifting uneasily, but the man in the suit didn't seem to care about their discomfort. He stood tall, eyes locked on John, almost as if he were waiting for John to understand, waiting for him to make the right choice. The decision wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about uncovering the truth, about confronting his past and the darkness that had been hidden from him for so long. John's mind was spinning, but his resolve didn't waver. He was no longer just trying to escape or survive. Now, he had a mission: to uncover what was going on, to expose the players behind this operation, and to take them down once and for all. But he couldn't do it alone. It was time to turn the tables. Without warning, John moved. His body was a blur of motion as he rolled to the side, using the cover of crates and shadows to his advantage. His training kicked in. This was his territory now. As he drew his weapon, he calculated the angles, his mind mapping out each move with military precision. In a flash, the air was thick with the sound of gunfire. The bikers scrambled, their previous calm shattered in an instant. John fired strategically, aiming for the weapons in their hands, disabling them without taking unnecessary risks. His every move was a step closer to unraveling the larger mystery, and a step closer to taking down the operation once and for all. As the chaos unfolded, John's eyes never left the man in the suit. The moment of confrontation was near, and John was ready to finally confront the truth about who he was, what he'd been involved in, and what it would take to bring this operation to its knees. The fight had just begun. The noise of the gunfire echoed through the dimly lit warehouse. The bikers, once so confident, were now scrambling in a blind panic. Some tried to take cover behind the stacks of crates, while others, stunned by the sudden violence, hesitated just long enough for John to close the gap. He was calm, methodical, his movements fluid, like a man who had been here before, countless times. He wasn't just fighting to survive anymore. He was fighting to end this, once and for all. John's eyes locked on the man in the suit. He knew that the battle with the bikers was only the first hurdle. The real fight, the one that would decide everything, was with him. This man knew more about John's past than he cared to admit, and he wasn't about to let him walk away without revealing everything. As the chaos around him continued, John made his way toward the man, his steps silent but purposeful. He had no intention of letting this man slip through his fingers. The time for questions was over. It was time for answers. "You've made a big mistake, John," the man called out, his voice eerily calm amid the chaos. "You think you can take me down, but you have no idea what you're dealing with." John's grip on his weapon tightened. The man's words were meant to provoke him, but John wasn't falling for it. The man's arrogance was his greatest weakness. It was clear now that he thought he was untouchable, that this was all just a game to him. But John wasn't playing games. He was here for one thing: to get to the truth. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," John muttered, his voice low and controlled, despite the rush of adrenaline coursing through him. His eyes narrowed as he reached the man, the distance closing between them with each step. The man in the suit smiled, almost as if he were waiting for John to say those exact words. He stepped forward, maintaining eye contact, his posture relaxed, almost casual. He wasn't intimidated. In fact, he seemed more amused than anything. "You think this is a fight, John? This isn't a fight. This is a reckoning," the man said, his voice taking on an almost philosophical tone. "You've been a pawn in this game for far too long, and now you're going to see how deep the rabbit hole really goes." John's instincts screamed at him, warning him that there was more at play here than just some rogue operation. The man was toying with him, trying to get him to react emotionally, to throw him off balance. But John had been trained for situations just like this. He wasn't going to be manipulated. "Enough talk," John said, cutting through the man's monologue. "If you're really behind all this, then let's finish it." The man's smile faded slightly, but there was no fear in his eyes, only a chilling calm. He didn't seem to care that John was ready to end this. If anything, it seemed like he was waiting for something, waiting for John to make the first move. But John wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. Suddenly, the man in the suit reached into his jacket and pulled out a sleek black device. John's eyes instantly locked onto it. The device wasn't just a phone or a tablet. It was something else. Something far more dangerous. A signal jammer. Before John could react, the world around him flickered. His senses, sharpened by years of combat experience, immediately recognized the distortion. His earpiece, his connection to the outside world, went silent. He felt a wave of unease wash over him. The man wasn't just playing games. He was trying to isolate him, to prevent him from calling for backup, to take him down alone. For a brief moment, the world seemed to slow down. John's training kicked into high gear, assessing the situation, recalibrating. This was no longer just a physical battle. It was a war of information, a battle of wits. If he was going to survive this, he had to think several moves ahead. The man in the suit saw the flicker of recognition in John's eyes. "You didn't think it would be that easy, did you?" he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think your training makes you special, that you can take down anyone who stands in your way. But you're not the only one with resources, John. And you're not the only one who knows how to play this game." John's grip on his weapon tightened, but he remained focused. The signal jammer was just another obstacle, one he could overcome. He wasn't going to let it take him off his game. His mind raced as he formulated a new plan. This wasn't just about surviving the bikers anymore. This was about taking down the man in the suit and dismantling the network he had built. The man took another step forward, eyes gleaming with a dangerous, almost manic energy. "I know everything about you, John. I know your weaknesses, your fears. I've watched you long enough to understand how you think. You're predictable, just like everyone else. The only difference is that you think you're some kind of hero." John's jaw tightened. The man's words were calculated, designed to provoke, but they only fueled John's resolve. He wasn't going to let this man control the narrative anymore. He wasn't going to be some pawn in a game that was beyond his control. It was time to take the fight to him. With a sudden, decisive movement, John lunged forward. The man's eyes widened in shock, but it was too late. John had anticipated the move, and as the man tried to pull back, John tackled him to the ground, his body a blur of motion. The device went flying from his hand, skittering across the floor. The two men grappled on the ground, each trying to gain the upper hand. John was a trained fighter, and he knew how to use his opponent's strength against them. He twisted the man's arm, forcing him into a submission hold. But the man fought back with surprising strength. It wasn't just the physical fight anymore. It was a fight for control, for dominance. "You're not going to win this, John," the man hissed through gritted teeth, struggling beneath John's grip. "You can't win. Not against me. Not against us." John's eyes locked onto the man's, and in that moment, everything became clear. The man was part of something much larger, something that reached far beyond this warehouse, beyond the bikers, beyond anything John had anticipated. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about uncovering the truth, about dismantling the shadow network that had been operating under the radar for so long. With a final, calculated move, John disarmed the man, his muscles straining as he pinned the man to the floor. The battle wasn't over. But for the first time, John felt like he was in control. The man might have had the upper hand for a while, but now, it was John who held the power. "You're wrong," John said, his voice cold and resolute. "I'm not here to win. I'm here to finish this." The man in the suit's eyes flickered with something close to fear for the first time. And John knew. This was only the beginning of the war. John kept his grip tight on the man's arms, ensuring that his prey couldn't escape. The man in the suit, despite his best efforts to break free, was pinned down, the weight of John's experience holding him in place. The warehouse was eerily silent except for their heavy breathing. John had finally managed to gain the upper hand, but he knew better than to let his guard down. The game was far from over. "Talk," John demanded, his voice like steel. "Tell me everything. Who are you working for? Who's behind all of this?" The man in the suit only smirked. "You think I'll just tell you everything? You think I'm going to spill my secrets to you?" He tried to move, but John twisted his arm, sending a shock of pain through him. "I'm not asking," John replied, his voice laced with authority. "I'm telling you. You will talk, and you will tell me everything. It's the only way you'll walk out of here alive." The man's smirk faded, his expression turning into a mask of frustration. "You have no idea what you're up against," he muttered. "You're just a tool, a pawn in a game far bigger than you could ever comprehend. No one gets out of this alive. Not you, not your precious Navy buddies." John's mind raced as the words echoed in his ears. This wasn't just about bikers, about petty crime. The man was talking about something far deeper. This web stretched beyond the streets, beyond the criminal underworld. Whoever was pulling the strings was connected to a far-reaching network, one that spanned countries and continents, manipulating people like chess pieces in a game with stakes that John couldn't even begin to fathom. "I don't need to understand the whole picture right now," John said, his voice cold as he applied more pressure. "I just need to know who you're working for. I'll unravel the rest." The man sneered, his face twisted in disdain. "You think you're special, don't you? You think your Navy SEAL training makes you invincible. Well, you're not. You're just another soldier, doing someone else's bidding. They all think they're important, but in the end, we're all just disposable." John's eyes narrowed. The man's words were a reminder of the ruthlessness of the system he had once been a part of. A reminder that no matter how much you achieved, how many battles you fought, there were always people above you, calling the shots. And those people never saw you as anything more than a tool. But John wasn't just any soldier. He had been trained for situations like this. He had been trained to think 2 or 3 steps ahead, to fight, not just with brute strength, but with intelligence. The man was trying to manipulate him, to get him to question his worth, to make him doubt his purpose. It wasn't going to work. "You talk a lot," John said, tightening his grip on the man's arm. "But you're not telling me what I need to know. Who's behind you? Who's the one pulling the strings?" The man laughed, the sound bitter and devoid of any real amusement. "You really think I'm just going to hand over all the information you need? Like that?" He paused for a moment, as if weighing his options. You're too late. This is bigger than you. Bigger than your Navy buddies. The people you're chasing don't make mistakes. They don't lose. And when they find out you've been digging around in their business, he trailed off, as if the thought itself was enough to send a chill down his spine. John's mind raced. Whoever this man was working for, they were powerful. So powerful that they operated with impunity. They controlled the game from the shadows, unseen by the public, untouched by the law. And now, John was in the middle of it, tangled in a web that he could barely understand, let alone escape from. The man's eyes glinted with something. Pride, maybe. Or perhaps just the thrill of the power he wielded. You really don't know what you're up against, do you? The people behind this have connections everywhere. Government, business, military. They've been pulling the strings for years. And now, you're caught in the middle. There's no way out. John's blood ran cold as the man spoke. He knew that in situations like this, people didn't just disappear. They were erased. Their pasts were wiped clean. Their identities erased from existence. It wasn't just about physical strength. It was about resources. And this man, whoever he was, had more resources than John could ever dream of. You think you're going to scare me? John asked, his voice a low growl. I've seen worse than you. I've faced down enemies far more dangerous than whatever this shadow organization is. So tell me, or I'll make you. The man's face twisted in anger, but he remained silent. John could see the conflict in his eyes. The man was afraid. Afraid of the people he was working for. Afraid of what might happen if he gave up too much information. But he wasn't going to break easily. John knew this wasn't going to be a simple interrogation. You're wasting your time, the man said, his voice trembling now. They'll find you. They'll hunt you down. And then you'll be sorry. You think you're the hero in this story, but you're just another casualty. John's heart raced as the pieces started to fall into place. The web the man spoke of wasn't just a criminal network. It was an entire system. A shadow world that had infiltrated every level of society. And if John didn't find a way to bring it down, it would consume him. And anyone who stood in its way. John's grip tightened, but he kept his focus. The man was trying to distract him, trying to make him lose his cool. But John wouldn't let that happen. Not now. Not when he was so close to the truth. I'm not going anywhere, John said, his voice hard. You're going to tell me what I need to know, or I'll make you regret it. For a long moment, there was silence between them, the tension thick in the air. Then, with a reluctant sigh, the man spoke. It's not just about you, John. It's about everything. The organization, whatever you want to call them, they're everywhere. And if you want to stop them, you'll have to tear everything down. And when you do, you'll find yourself alone. Alone, with nothing but the knowledge that you'll never escape. John's mind raced. Alone. The word echoed in his head. He had spent years fighting alongside others, as part of a team. But if this was as big as the man said, if the network was as powerful as he claimed, then John might be the only one who could take it down. I'll take my chances, John said, finally letting go of the man's arm. I've always worked alone, and I'll continue to do so. But you, John's eyes hardened. You're going to regret messing with me. The man's expression flickered for a moment, and then, with a resigned sigh, he spoke again. Fine. You want to know who's behind all of this. You really want to know who's pulling the strings. John's heart pounded in his chest. This was it. The moment he had been waiting for. The answers were just within reach. The man's lips twitched as if he were trying to suppress a smile, but it was a smile filled with a mix of bitterness and disdain. For a moment, John thought he might just continue with his taunts, refusing to say anything. But then, the man exhaled sharply, his shoulders slumping slightly as if the weight of the truth was too much to carry. You want to know who's behind it all? he repeated, his voice low and grudging. All right, I'll tell you, but you won't like it. John's pulse quickened. He had been on this journey for so long, chasing shadows, trying to piece together the larger puzzle. And now, finally, it seemed like he was about to get the answers he had been seeking. But he had learned never to take anything at face value. Whoever was behind all of this, they would be dangerous. No, they would be lethal. The deeper this went, the more it felt like he was walking into a trap. The man in front of him eyed him for a moment longer, his eyes calculating, assessing. Finally, with a sharp breath, he began. The organization is called the Black Falcon Network. You've probably never heard of them, but they're everywhere. They've got their hands in just about every pie. Government contracts, military, international intelligence, corporations. Hell, they're even involved in media and entertainment. They control things from the shadows. They manipulate entire countries, wars, elections, public opinion. They've been doing it for decades. John's mind raced, trying to process the gravity of what the man was saying. The Black Falcon Network. The name sounded ominous enough, but the power they wielded was something else entirely. They were more than just a criminal syndicate. They were a hidden force that seemed to shape the course of history itself. This isn't just some gang you're dealing with, the man continued, his voice growing softer, but more insistent. These people are professionals. You can't touch them without bringing down the entire system. They've infiltrated law enforcement, intelligence agencies, even the military. You think you've got the skills to take them down? You're a pawn in a much larger game, John. And once they get wind of what you're trying to do, it won't just be you they're coming after. John felt his stomach twist. This was far beyond anything he could have imagined. The idea of a rogue group operating within the shadows of the world was terrifying enough, but to think that they had infiltrated nearly every facet of global power, from governments to multinational corporations, it was a nightmare, one that John now realized he had stumbled into. Why are you telling me this? John asked, his voice sharp, as if he needed to keep the man talking, keep the thread of information coming. The man shrugged, as if resigned to his fate. What does it matter? You won't believe me anyway. You'll go after them, and you'll get yourself killed, just like all the others who tried. You won't be able to stop it. This is bigger than any one person, even someone like you. John's fingers flexed, his fist tightening at the man's words. The man was trying to break his resolve, to convince him that all of this was futile. But John wasn't someone who was easily swayed. If anything, hearing the depths of the situation only fueled his determination. This organization had to be brought down. Where do I start? John asked, his voice steady but laced with urgency. The man hesitated, clearly weighing his options. You can't just go after them directly. You'll be walking into a trap you can't escape. The Black Falcon Network operates in a way that you can't even imagine. They have operatives everywhere, and they control entire cities with their influence. But if you want to do something about it, you'll need to start with the outer ring. The foot soldiers. The ones who don't know the full extent of the organization. John nodded. He understood. For every large, powerful organization, there were smaller, more visible players that could be dealt with first. By dismantling them, he could uncover more pieces of the puzzle. But it wasn't going to be easy. Give me names, John demanded. Give me something concrete. The man's face tightened, as if he were fighting an internal battle. I can't. They'll kill me if I do. But if you really want to take them down, you have to go after the supply chains, the money. They're heavily involved in arms dealing, human trafficking, drugs. Everything that's illegal, they're in the middle of it. Start with their money, and you can cripple them. But it's not going to be easy. And once you start pulling on that thread, there's no going back. John's mind spun as the man's words sank in. Arms dealing, human trafficking, drugs. This wasn't just a criminal syndicate with street-level operations. It was a global enterprise, one with its claws in some of the darkest, most profitable industries in the world. And now, John was being dragged into the heart of it. "Who else is involved?" John asked, his voice insistent. The man swallowed hard. "You don't get it. It's not about individuals. It's a network. You'll never know who's truly involved unless you dig deep. The deeper you go, the more dangerous it becomes. Trust me, John. You don't want to get too close." But John wasn't going to back off now. He had come too far to turn back. His fingers clenched around the man's arm as he gave him one last hard look. "I don't care how deep it goes. I'll take them down. And I'll start with you." The man's eyes widened for a moment, then narrowed as he seemed to resign himself to his fate. "You think you can stop this?" he asked with a dark chuckle. "You'll need more than just yourself. They're everywhere, John. Even your own government is compromised. It's not just the bikers you're dealing with. It's a shadow war, one that's been going on for years. You're too late." John's mind raced. If what the man was saying was true, this was much bigger than he had imagined. This wasn't just about bikers or organized crime. This was about an entity with the power to manipulate governments, to control the flow of global events from the shadows. The Black Falcon Network wasn't just an enemy. It was an all-encompassing system that seemed invincible. "Tell me how to take them down," John demanded, his voice firm, unwavering. The man's lips curled into a sneer. "I've already told you. Start small. But remember, John, this is bigger than you. And once you start, there's no turning back." John's resolve hardened. If it was a war the Black Falcon Network wanted, then a war they would get. But the stakes were higher than ever. The man's words lingered in the air like smoke, the heaviness of his warning seeping deep into John's bones. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a war, one that stretched far beyond what he had initially imagined. The more he heard, the more he realized how massive and insidious the Black Falcon Network really was. And now, it wasn't just about fighting back against a group of bikers or random criminals. It was about taking on an entire shadow empire. The weight of the decision hit John hard. He had always been someone who thrived under pressure, who could make split-second decisions in life-or-death situations. But this was different. This was bigger, darker, and more dangerous than anything he had ever faced. As he glanced at the man before him, now shaking, his nerves betraying the tough facade he had put on, John knew that his mission had just taken on a life of its own. There would be no turning back. "Tell me about the supply chains," John pressed, his voice calm but insistent. "You said they're involved in arms dealing, human trafficking, drugs, everything. But where does it all come from? How do they get their hands on everything?" The man hesitated, clearly fighting with himself. His mind was a tangled mess of fear and desperation. But there was something else there too, something John could see beneath the surface. "Regret. You need to understand something," the man began, his voice trembling slightly. "The network doesn't just deal with physical goods. They control information, they manufacture chaos, and they profit from it. Every conflict, every war, every political instability, it's all orchestrated by them. They have eyes and ears in every corner of the globe. They've been at the center of it all for years, pulling the strings in silence." John leaned in, his breath steady but his mind racing. He could feel the tension in the air, the sense that they were on the verge of something explosive. "So, you're telling me that they control global events? Wars, elections, everything?" The man nodded. "Yes, they control it all. They profit from both sides of every conflict. They arm both the good guys and the bad guys. They fund both political parties. They manipulate the media. It's all a game to them. And they've been playing it for decades, making billions, controlling lives without anyone even knowing it." John couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had always known that power and influence ran deep in the world. But this was something else entirely. The Black Falcon Network wasn't just a group of criminals. They were the puppeteers of the world, manipulating everything from behind the scenes. And the deeper John went, the more he realized how small his understanding had been. "How do I take them down?" John asked, his voice growing firmer with each word. "You said I have to start small. Where do I begin?" The man's face tightened, his fear palpable. "You can't just go after them. They'll see you coming from a mile away. You'll need to break down the network piece by piece, but even that's not going to be easy. The Black Falcon Network doesn't just have money. They have influence. They have power in places you wouldn't even believe. You'll need allies, information, a strategy, and above all, you'll need patience." John clenched his jaw. "I don't have patience. I've already wasted enough time." The man shook his head. "It's not about patience, John. It's about being smart. If you rush in, you'll get yourself killed. And worse, you'll expose yourself to the entire network. You need to go after the people who are working for them. They're the ones who can lead you to the top. The supply chains, the dealers, the middlemen. Those are your targets." John's mind was spinning, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just a mission. This was going to be an all-out war. The first target was the outer ring, the people who didn't know everything, the ones who were just doing the grunt work. But even that wouldn't be easy. The Black Falcon Network wasn't some small-time operation. They were everywhere, like a disease, spreading their influence far and wide. "Where do I find them?" John pressed, his focus razor-sharp. The man swallowed hard, his eyes darting around as if he were searching for a way out. "They're scattered. You'll find them in every major city, every black market. But their true base is harder to pinpoint. They don't operate out of a single location. It's decentralized. They have safe houses, networks, even people embedded in legitimate businesses. You'll need to work your way through them. But be careful. They're watching. They always know what's happening before you do." John's mind raced, trying to piece everything together. The enormity of the task was overwhelming, but it also fueled his determination. There was no turning back now. He had made the decision to bring this network down, and nothing was going to stop him. As John processed the man's words, he could feel the weight of the moment. This was no longer just about taking down a few bikers or criminals. It was about taking on an entire global organization that operated like a shadowy force, controlling the world from behind closed doors. And John knew that the fight was just beginning. "Are there any other leads?" John asked, trying to keep the conversation going, to get any last pieces of information that might be helpful. "Any other people who can help?" The man's eyes shifted nervously, and for a moment, he seemed to be considering how much more to reveal. But then, as if he had reached some sort of breaking point, he spoke. "You need to talk to someone who has been on the inside," the man said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Someone who used to work for them. There's a woman. Her name is Maria Alvarez. She was high up in the network, but she's gone into hiding. If anyone knows how to take them down, it's her." John's heart skipped a beat. Maria Alvarez. The name didn't mean anything to him yet, but he knew one thing. Finding her was now his priority. If she had the information he needed, then she was his best chance at getting closer to the heart of the Black Falcon Network. And if she was hiding, it meant she was running for a reason. "I'll find her," John said, his voice calm but resolute. "And when I do, we'll end this." The man's eyes softened for a moment, almost as if he were relieved. But that relief quickly turned back into fear. "Be careful, John. The deeper you go, the more dangerous it gets. They'll stop at nothing to protect their secrets." John stood, his resolve unshaken. He was already deep in this fight, and nothing was going to stop him now. The Black Falcon Network had made a fatal mistake by crossing his path. Now, it was his turn to hunt them down, one piece at a time. With one last look at the trembling man, John turned and walked out, already thinking of his next move. The war had begun, and he was ready for whatever came next. John's journey had taken him into the darkest corners of the world. What began as a fight for survival had evolved into something far more dangerous, far more complex. He wasn't just battling against a few rogue bikers or petty criminals anymore. He had become a part of something much larger, a fight against an invisible empire that had its fingers in every aspect of life. The Black Falcon Network, a ruthless global force, had underestimated the quiet man they had once harassed. They didn't know who they were dealing with. As John continued his pursuit, the world around him seemed to shift. Every decision, every lead, every encounter seemed to build toward something bigger, something that he couldn't fully comprehend yet. But he knew one thing. He had to keep going. The stakes were higher than ever. The lives of countless innocent people hung in the balance, and every moment wasted meant that the Black Falcon Network could tighten its grip on the world. Finding Maria Alvarez was just the beginning. With her knowledge, John could infiltrate deeper into the heart of the Black Falcon Empire. Her insider knowledge could expose their secrets, reveal their connections, and, finally, bring them down. But he couldn't afford to get careless. He couldn't let his guard down, not for a second. The network was watching, and they were always one step ahead. As John tracked down every lead, he saw the pieces of the puzzle slowly coming together. From the streets of gritty cities to the high-end offices of powerful elites, the Black Falcon Network's influence was everywhere. The more he uncovered, the more horrifying it became. They didn't just control the underworld. They controlled the levers of power in governments, in corporations, in every level of society. They played both sides in every conflict, profiting off human suffering and chaos. The Black Falcon Network wasn't just a criminal organization. They were the architects of a world built on greed and manipulation. But John wasn't intimidated. He had faced the worst the world could throw at him during his time in the Navy SEALs. He had fought wars, saved lives, and put himself in harm's way countless times. This was no different. This fight was just as personal, just as dangerous. But now, he had something the Black Falcon Network never expected: the sheer will to tear them apart from the inside out. With every operation he carried out, every enemy he took down, the network grew more desperate. They didn't know who was hunting them, but they knew someone was coming for them. The fear began to set in. The cracks in their armor started to appear. The web they had so carefully woven began to unravel, piece by piece. And with each move John made, the closer he got to the one thing that could bring it all to an end: Maria Alvarez. Finally, after months of tracking, John found her, hidden in the depths of an abandoned safe house. She was a woman marked by the past. Her eyes were haunted, but they still burned with the fire of someone who had lived through hell and survived. She knew the cost of betrayal, the price of the information she held. But she was ready to give it all up. The Black Falcon Network had done more than just destroy her life. They had destroyed everything she had ever believed in. Together, John and Maria launched their final assault. With her inside knowledge and his relentless determination, they dismantled the network, one layer at a time. The power players, the middlemen, the operatives, they all fell, and the empire they had built crumbled beneath their feet. In the end, it was not just about stopping the Black Falcon Network. It was about sending a message. The world wasn't theirs to control, and those who thought they could manipulate others from the shadows would not go unpunished. John stood at the edge of the battlefield, breathing heavily, surveying the wreckage of what had once been an invincible force. The Black Falcon Network was no more. It had taken everything he had: his mind, his body, his soul. But he had done it. He had brought them down. And as the dust settled, John knew that the fight didn't end here. The world was still full of dark corners, full of people who would try to exploit others for their own gain. But now, there was hope. And John would always be there, watching, waiting for the next threat to rise. Because he knew, deep down, that he was more than just a former Navy SEAL. He was a man who had made a promise to protect the world, even when it seemed like everything was lost. The war against darkness was never over. But for now, John had won.